I'm joined tonight by Jan Irvin. Jan is an independent researcher, author, lecturer. He's the host of Gnostic Media, an open-source website dedicated to investigating education, mythology, mystery schools, theology, politics, sociology, and much more. He also hosts the Gnostic Media podcast. His website is gnosticmedia.com. He joins me tonight to discuss his research regarding the origins of the modern psychedelic movement and the 1960s counterculture. Jan has argued that virtually the entire psychedelic/hippie scene was a PsyOp, or a mind control program, conducted by the elites through their various intelligence agencies, think tanks, corporations, universities, etc. Jan, is that a fair characterization of your view on this?
Oh, it sounds a little bit loaded to me, but I would say I provide the citations and primary evidence where these people show themselves how that's the fact.
Okay, so that's what I want to do. Tonight I just want to give you the opportunity to go over the evidence you've uncovered that supports that thesis, and we can discuss that and in detail, or at least how much ever time we have. And you have a couple of very fascinating articles, detailed articles. One was Manufacturing the Deadhead, which was published a few years ago, and this recent one, which is the what is that one? It's the Spies in Academic Clothing, the untold history of MKUltra and the counterculture.
Did you have a chance to read those?
I read that. I've read Manufacturing Deadhead a little while ago, and I just actually finished Spies in Academic Clothing this weekend.
Oh, good. Did you have a chance to read the Enthusians, What's in a Name? That's pretty good too, I think.
Only part of it, but I've listened to several of your lectures regarding that topic.
Yeah, well, the issue is that an interview isn't really ever a very good representation of all of the detail that's laid out there, because that's a 54-page article.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
So how would you want to go into this? What's the best way to wade into this?
Well, where do you want to begin, essentially?
First of all, we have I'll start with the mainstream view, and the way that most people think, the way you've been taught about the 1960s was the much, let's say, post-war America, because it just really goes back into just after World War II, really, maybe even a little bit before, if you want to get into it with modern advertising and stuff like that. But really, the CIA, which was formed in 1947, and some of their programs, which just started around the Korean War. But as far as the 1960s, we get the idea that much of the 60s, the whole scene, the hippie scene, the counterculture scene, it was sort of like an organic or natural development arising out of circumstances that weren't necessarily planned or just sort of happened because of these events.
Yeah.
But your research, and I think you do provide good support for this, is that much of this was planned or manipulated. And
yeah, sure. Well, first off, we have to ask, where do we get this idea that it was an organic outgrowth, et cetera? And then when we look into the origins of those sources, such as, let's say, John D. Marks in his book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, or Acid Dreams by Marty Lee and Bruce Lane, or Operation Mind Control by Walter Board, et cetera. And maybe, another important one to mention would be Storming Heaven by Jay Stevens. Excuse me. These are the primary sources of where that storyline came from. And the issue is, as my newest article, Spies in Academic Clothing, which I released on May 13th, last month, people can go right onto the Gnostic Media website, and it's the fourth posting down from the top right there on the front page, and people can read that right there. But what I discovered there was that essentially, starting with John D. Marks, what most people don't realize is that he was the assistant to the director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. So it's a bit foolhardy to take a story from an intelligence agency. It's like the fox investigating the hen house, right? You gotta sort of question that a little bit. And, so Walter Board is the same thing. Who was Walter Board? Well, he was the owner and publisher of the East Village Other. He was also the husband of Peggy Mellon Hitchcock of the Mellon banking empire. And he was, his wife, or his brother-in-law, owned the Millbrook Mansion where Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner and all these guys did all of their tests, Artie Lang, etc. And his wife also funded the Grateful Dead's first album, and Billy Hitchcock ran Billy Hitchcock LSD Enterprises, and he was one of the largest manufacturers and distributors of LSD. You know, this is the Mellon banking family. So these are all things that we're not really told about. And, you know, and furthermore, Walter Boert did an interview with Timothy Leary, and he and Timothy Leary had worked together for many years, actually. But he did an interview with Leary where Leary admitted that he was a witting CIA agent by 62. And these are things that we're never told. We're also not told regarding the outline of LSD, that it was actually Tim Leary who went before Congress, amongst others, but it was Tim Leary who went before Congress and requested LSD's outlaw. Now, why would he do this? It's a Hegelian dialectic, but essentially they couldn't kick off the psychedelic revolution as they wanted to with this professor, you know, Timothy Leary, promoting psychotomimetics, which are psychosis mimicking drugs. So they had to rename the drugs. The actual names of these quote unquote psychedelic substances affect the outcome in the name itself. In fact, because of this, in my last article that I published in November, Entheogens, What's in a Name, I recommended that we begin to call them suggestogens because there's a lot of evidence that they cause hypersuggestibility. And we also see at Millbrook that they were studying hypersuggestibility and these sorts of things too. So, you know, the hypersuggestibility is this huge underlying factor, but the names themselves cause the outcome of the experience. And then we see Timothy Leary and Oscar Janiger bragging about this and some of the work that I've cited in that article and in the latest one as well. But the evidence shows that the intelligence community wanted to lead and control the conversation about MKUltra and what it was really about. They wanted to throw smaller aspects under the bus to protect the larger operation, which was the psychedelic revolution. So they could throw out things like James Moore or the whole Manchurian Candidate idea and keep people looking at that and say, oh, well, that was just those two guys. They were a part of MKUltra. It wasn't anything bigger than that. So basically it's a red herring or a scapegoat. Quick, look over there. And so you're following that instead of realizing that, hey, there's a larger picture here. And the issue is in all of those books, and my article, Spies in Academic Clothing, it reviews 7 of the main books on MKUltra and shows how the entire story was fabricated and that each of these guys were working were either agents or assets of the intelligence community and wrote this narrative, and then each of the subsequent books on MKUltra repeat that same narrative. And we see that, these guys are helping each other with writing the books, etc., giving feedback on the books. And then we see them each point to those books after they've worked on it behind the scenes to say, look at that book over there, that's the official story. So what appears to the public as an organic outgrowth is in fact totally controlled. So what I want to do real quick is I want to read you 2 quotes. The first one is from Francis Donner Saunders in his book, The Cultural Cold War. And this quote explains that, well, I'll just read it here, and let me just have a sip of water. But she says, books differ from all other propaganda media, wrote a chief of the CIA's covert action staff, primarily because one single book can significantly change the reader's attitude and action to an extent unmatched by the impact of any other single medium, such as to make books the most important weapon of strategic long-range propaganda. The CIA's clandestine book program was run according to the same source with the following aims in mind: get books published or distributed abroad without revealing any U.S. influence by covertly subsidizing foreign publications or booksellers, get books published which should not be contaminated by any covert tie with the U.S. government, especially if the position of the author is quote-unquote delicate. Get books published for operational reasons, regardless of commercial viability. Initiate and subsidize indigenous national or international organizations for book publishing or distributing purposes. Stimulate the writing of publicly significant books by unknown foreign authors, either by directly subsidizing the author if covert contact is feasible, or indirectly through literary agents or publishers. The New York Times alleged in 1977 that the CIA had been involved in the publication of at least 1,000 books, and that's by then. And what the article shows is that it wasn't focused just on overseas books. And in fact, in the article, I quote Howard Zinn, who talks about them doing this in the American universities and somewhat directing it at the U.S. population. But with these books on MKUltra, which in fact Francis Donner Saunders and Howard Zinn's quotes are coming from the church committee hearings on MKUltra, the same program that my research and work is on that we're here discussing today. So Professor Carol Quigley was Bill Clinton's professor at Georgetown University. And he says, by the interaction of these various branches on one another, under the pretense that each branch was an autonomous power, the influence of each branch was an autonomous power, and the influence of each branch was increased through the process of mutual reinforcement. The unanimity among the various branches was believed by the outside world to be the result of the influence of a single truth. So the official story of the organic outgrowth of MKUltra. While really it was the result of the existence of a single group. Thus a statesman or a member of the group announces a public policy, and he's referencing politics here, but this is exactly how it works with MKUltra or anything else. Announces a public policy. About the same time, the Royal Institute of International Affairs publishes a study on the subject. And an Oxford Don, a fellow of All Souls, and a member of the group also publishes a volume on the subject, probably through a publishing house like G. Bell & Sons or Faber & Faber, allied to the group. The statesman's policy is subjected to critical analysis and final approval in a leader in the Times, while two books are reviewed in a single review in the Times Literary Supplement. And he's talking about in the London Times. Both the leader and the review are anonymous, but are written by members of the group. And finally, at about the same time, an anonymous article about the Roundtable strongly advocates the same policy. The cumulative effect of such tactics is this: even if each tactical move influences only a small number of important people, is bound to be great. So we can see, this is Carol Quigley, Bill Clinton's professor, describing exactly how it's done. And in fact, we've seen them use examples of this, such as against John Allegro back in the 1970s. In fact, in the Times and the Times Literary Supplement. That's exactly where they attacked him, ironically.
That was his research regarding the mushroom, correct?
That was his work regarding the sacred mushroom, the cross,
okay.
He was a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, and he was one of the original 8, and he was the only one to publish his work in a timely fashion. In fact, he published all of his work by 1968, and none of the other scholars published anything until 1993. And Allegro is why we even know about the Dead Sea Scrolls today. He published 6 books before that, bringing attention to the Dead Sea Scrolls, trying to raise money for them, etc. So he was actually also the one who was able to raise enough money to bring the scrolls together into one place so that they could be translated, whereas they were otherwise being carted off into private collections, etc. So based on his work on the Dead Sea Scrolls and working intimately with all of this material, he discovered anciently that these substances were used for religious purposes. And we see even today them creating religions from these substances. And, early on when I published my first book, I believed in the true, or in a religiosity, or believed that the religiosity from these substances was real. When in subsequent work I discovered and analyzed all the work on hypersuggestibility and how they've been used throughout history for inculcating the youth into the local group or the local, community. So, I had to go back through and review the beliefs that I had in my youth when I went through those very inculcations, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So, you have to be able to stand back and go, wow, look at that. I was wrong,
That's probably one of the most difficult things to do.
Well, and if you want to do real research, you have to be able to do this. And, and it's like people will say, well, you said this back then. It's like, well, and I also said that I changed my mind based on these discoveries, and I explained why. And you're looking at a fallacy of chronology, of time. So, just because I said something in my 20s or 30s doesn't mean that I haven't, exposed primary research that changed all of that. And the reason why is what I believed before was based on secondary citations, which were based on these groups and cells that we were just discussing.
Yeah.
Versus now my opinions are based on digging all the way down through that garbage and all the way down to look at the original primary citations so that I know exactly what those people said themselves and not all the clutter and smoke and mirrors that's built up around that.
And what you're saying is these substances, these mind-altering substances, rather than having a truly spiritual use, they're used to promote irrationality, mysticism, and confusion for the purposes of tyranny.
That's exactly right. That's well put, in fact. And, what we see, there's a famous quote that I discovered about 4 years ago. I was listening to Leonard Peikoff, his Introduction to Logic series, or maybe his History of Philosophy or something like that, and he's a randy, and I just wanted to hate him, but I wanted to listen to this stuff and just see what this guy was about, and that's another thing is, when you have a gut reaction that you just hate somebody's work that you've never read or studied, that means you should probably go read it and study it. So So that's what I was going through the process of doing. I was like, oh man, I'm like, well, he's an ass, or some ad hominem, blah, 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 right? And, I realized, well, I didn't have any valid things other than fallacious attacks against these people. So I had to sit down and listen to it. And at the end of one of those two, lectures from Peikoff, he said, mysticism is the tool of tyrants. And that hit me like a truck. And I was on a long drive coming down from Central California, and I started processing that, and I said, well, instead of name-calling at him and using fallacies and whatever else I can do to avoid what he said, I'm going to see if I can find any instances where mysticism might not be used as a tool for tyrants. And then I started thinking about it, and years later I still couldn't find anything that couldn't be used for that system of control, and so this is where, and when you start studying like things like Aleister Crowley or the occult or how the intelligence community works, it's all based on occult, spiritualism, mysticism, all of this stuff. The intelligence community is and has always been totally enshrouded in that type of stuff. So then you start, studying about how these guys operated. There's a book, Aleister Crowley, Agent 666 or whatever. And it talks about how he was an agent and, how the occult and all of this stuff have always been synonymous with the intelligence community and spies and all of that. So as you start looking into all this, you start seeing it. Okay, well, Leary, Huxley, Wass, and they're all promoting magic, they're all promoting mysticism, but it was because of all of the attacks. See, in 2008, I published a book called The Holy Mushroom that went into all of the attacks against John Allegro in his book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and I laid all of his claims out, what he said in the book. Then I laid out his footnotes, and then I went and got each citation and, put it right there with everything else. And what I discovered was that all of the attacks against Allegro regarding his quote-unquote psychedelic or suggestogen research was that all of the attacks against him were totally false. All of his citations checked out. So what happened was that forced me to look in the other direction toward Gordon Wasson and these guys and, start digging into their research. So about 2007, I realized that Gordon Wasson was CIA, but I didn't have the documentation to prove it. It took me, several more years of research to start gathering up the documents. And in fact, Wasson was the head of MKUltra Subproject 58 with J.P. Morgan Bank. And we do have the primary documents now today that expose all of that and expose that he worked directly with the Council on Foreign Relations, with the CIA. I have private letters that were released via FOIA requests from the CIA of him commuting directly with Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, just 5 weeks before his famous May 13, 1957 Life magazine article, Seeking the Magic Mushroom, was published. So now we have all of the documentation of this history. We have the documentation that the James Moore story, the mole that infiltrated Wasson's team to Oaxaca, is a bunch of malarkey. And the Subproject 58 letter that the CIA released in 1977 very clearly shows that it was Wasson who requested the money from the Geschichter Fund, not James Moore. And James Moore, Albert Hoffman, Roger Heim, Masha Wasson, Valentina Wasson, etc., Alan Richardson, they were all personnel, essentially assets and agents for the CIA. And then each of them subsequently, when you read the official history, they all refer back to the official storyline that was published by John Marks in 1979. And I show that all of those guys collaborated with John Marks to help him write his book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. So, they created this whole illusion of the organic thing, and that, the CIA were just dupes and stupid and they didn't know what they were doing, and it was all blowback. The drugs just got out of the CIA's control. But in fact, the CIA launched it, and then what happens is at some point it begins to run on its own, and then they can just sort of let it go, and it's then it's operating. It's moving along. The public has bought the official storyline, and it's like now the wheels are turning on its own, like Albert Hoffman and Bicycle Day. The whole Bicycle Day story is pretty ridiculous, and I've been investigating that for a couple years. All right, so the story with Albert Hoffman and Bicycle Day, we have quotes from these guys, and let me just pull one up here that's a really good one regarding just part of the story that I've found on Bicycle Day. Hold on just a second. So this is from Willis Harriman, who worked at the Stanford Research Institute. He was behind the book that came out of MKUltra called Changing Images of Man, about creating a new culture and religion for society to sell all of this stuff. And he worked directly with a number of people from MKUltra, including Al Hubbard and many others that I show in my article, in Spies in Academic Clothing. And, I quote all of these people directly so people can go in there and look at this material for themselves and go and check those citations. These are not things that I'm making up and saying. I'm quoting these people as saying this themselves. When I say that Timothy Leary is an agent, I'm providing everyone the citation in that article where they can go and read Leary saying it for himself, that he was recruited and was a willful agent since 1962. And then later on in 1979, he's still talking about the undercover agents and the cells that he was working with. So This one is from Willis Herman. He says, quote, "The story starts way back in 1935." And let me just interject here real quick that Willis Herman's story is also a cover story, but it gives more of the detail. And we've traced the whole invention of LSD back to earlier than this. But the story starts way back in 1935 with a group of followers of the German mystic Rudolf Steiner, who lived in a village in southern Germany. In 1935, a dark cloud was over Europe, so the members of this group set out very deliberately to synthesize chemicals that were the natural vegetable substances that they were well aware had been used in all the world's major religious traditions down through the centuries. By 1938, they had synthesized psilocybin, LSD, and about 30 other drugs. They had stopped to think about the consequences of letting this loose and decided against it. They decided that they were not sure what the negative effects of the drug would be, and that it wasn't a very wise thing to do. 5 years later, in 1943, when Europe was finally in really bad shape, they decided apparently that possible negative consequences were nothing compared to the consequences of not doing this. So this is obviously a cover story. They hadn't tested these things. First they have a bunch of presumptions. But when we see how these things are used throughout religion, we can see that they're trying to force things on the people. And in reality, the war was caused by the elites, et cetera, and elite families, and was really a genocide on the masses. And it's pretty preposterous to blame the masses for what the elite and governments had created. But he goes on and he says, "Now, 2 members of this group, which lived in a very tight religious community, were in the Sandoz Chemical Company. That's partly how this project came to be. One of them was the chemist Dr. Albert Hoffman. He cooked up the newspaper story that everyone has heard now about the accidental ingestion of LSD and the realization of what its properties were after an amazing bicycle ride home, and so on. And this group quietly gave supplies of the chemical to a number of doctors around the world. And then, of course, this story is ridiculous because they're predicting and blaming things on the people. They're turning history upside down and how wars work. The people usually have to be dragged into wars. You have to, recruit them and put them in systems where they, like drafts and things, and you send people to their homes to arrest them if they don't go off to do this stuff. And then what you do is you throw a bunch of boys in the ditches to kill each other off, and then you have the women in the wives and sisters in the factories and the mothers making the guns that they use to kill each other off. It's just eugenics. So this is, what they're doing, and they're blaming the masses for what the government had done. And then we see them working with this said same government to create this whole psychedelic revolution. And the reason why I say is we can trace LSD back before 1933 is Leo Perutz wrote a book called St. Peter's Snow in 1933, wherein he talks about a derivative of ergot or from a wheat fungus that was used to start a communist rebellion and revolution. So, we know that the drugs had to be synthesized at least by 1933.
Wow. So you mentioned Wasson, and that was the Time magazine, Life magazine article regarding the magic mushroom.
Right.
And it's interesting to note that, of course, Life magazine was part of the Time Life empire, which is run by C.D. Jackson and ultimately Henry Luce, right?
Henry Luce, right. Well, and Henry Luce worked with Wasson at the Century Club, and I do have letters from Alan Dulles. I have at least 3 or 4 letters from Alan Dulles approving different members to the Century Club, and I have Alan Dulles and Wasson. In fact, I think I have it in front of me here. Recruiting Ellsworth Bunker to the Century Club. So let me just see if I can find that. I'll have to, I just found it, and then I went right past it. I hit enter too fast. Sorry about that. So this is April 3, 1957. Dear Gordon, it was a pleasure to write a letter of recommendation of my good friend Ellsworth Bunker to the Century Association. I enclose a copy. It was good to hear from you. Let me know if you are in Washington. Alan Dulles.
And you mentioned the Gesticker Fund. These are these this is sort of the modus operandi of the intelligence agencies. They set up these foundations or funds as covers.
Sure. Well, sure. There was for MK Ultra, the primary ones were like the Geschichter Fund, the Human Ecology Fund, and then they did a lot of the research through a front group, which is still active today, called the Macy Foundation, created by Josiah Macy, and that is still running today. But, yeah.
And the Human Ecology Fund is the one that financed the Ewan Cameron's work, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yeah, and then also up in Saskatchewan was Humphrey Osmond and John Smithies, who worked directly with Aldous Huxley. Now, I have found significant evidence that people can read in that article, and there's a lot more in Huxley's own works, but Huxley was a key architect, along with Gregory Bateson and guys like Al Hubbard, for creating and launching the MKUltra program. And in fact, we know that MKUltra was funded the same week that that Huxley wrote Humphrey Osmond, requesting him to come down and dose him with mescaline. And that was the week of April 13, 1953, and MKUltra was funded April 13, 1953. So it all, it gets too ridiculous. If you want to be a coincidence theorist, and it's like the mathematical possibilities of this being a coincidence would be like hundreds of billions to one chance.
And of course, the objective or ideas behind MKUltra, you can trace back to the works of Aldous Huxley.
Well, and you can trace it back. Aldous Huxley was a member of the Fabian Society, but you can trace it back, all the way. It goes all the way back to ancient Rome, really. And
the idea, of a priest drugging the people.
Well, not even necessarily, again, like when you say the priest drugging the people, all you have to do is get the religion going. Eventually they could remove LSD from Bicycle Day, and people would still go out and do the ritual just because, it had already been started, and somebody will hear me say that and then go see if they can perpetuate that. But my point is, it's just like the MKUltra program itself, and even though they are still actively promoting it today, and you see a lot of these guys like James Fadiman, who was one of the last LSD researchers under MKUltra in the late 60s, early 70s, he's still out fully active, and he's done a number of it's hard to say they would be illegal LSD studies, but what he does is get people to get street LSD and then do studies, and then they report back to him and stuff like that. So a lot of this stuff is actually still going on today, and we saw that James Fadiman was also one of the SRI people working on changing images of man, and he was studying theater at Harvard, which is usually a real sign that they're an agent, because what better thing than acting to be an agent? You got to lie all the time and pretend you're someone else. So
yes, it's like being a magician or something, sleight of hand.
Yeah. Oh yeah, well yeah, Mulholland and Houdini were both agents, right? And Mulholland worked on MKUltra as well, and I do have that in my brain database on the website, but. Yeah, it's very common for magicians. Musicians are another good one, too, because musicians, they travel with a lot of gear and roadies and things like that, and they're a truck, or they're flying all over the place, and so they can bring a whole team in somewhere, Real easy to do like that.
I've heard there's been reports or research done regarding various people throughout the 20th century, some of the big names like Bob Hope, and of course, you're familiar with Dave McGowan's research regarding Laura Kane and the music scene, and this is where your work kind of blends, or your work actually you tend to substantiate a lot of what he uncovered.
I put the foundation and the why and what they were doing behind it, where he kind of goes up so far and then is like, I'm not sure, and then kind of walks away from it. I just kind of, take it from there.
What I read about when I was going through what you uncovered, it's almost like you substantiate the evidence he uncovers. And he's saying, well, it just isn't a coincidence. Something's going on here. Something happening here. It isn't exactly clear from a quote from the song. But yeah. You pulled us all the way back to, to the, I guess, as early as the 50s when CIA was really getting its legs, stretching its sea legs, and this MK Ultra project. But by the way, MK Ultra was kind of like an umbrella name for various programs.
Operations. Yeah, there was, now you're making me forget the number. I'm going to have to look it up. There's 149 sub-projects, something like that, or at least those are the ones that we know about that any information is leaked out on, But, I've been piecing together which projects were what for several years, and anytime I find any little crumb of data, I throw it in there, and then you start to stitch a picture together. I've got a large database for the audience who doesn't know. They can go to my Gnostic Media website at gnosticmedia.com, and up on the top bar there's a link called The Brain, and that will take them directly to my research database, and they can just go through that. You can spend hours or days on there and just go through it and, check out the citations and read how these people are affiliated. Usually you only have to go one or two steps to loop right back into the same group of people. So that gets really interesting, whereas like normally you might have 6, 8, 10 degrees separation for something. I mean, it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and it just repeats like that over and over. You barely have to take any steps, and you can see this pattern repeat throughout the entire thing, and especially how they all sort of lead up into, Aldous Huxley. It's when you start understanding Aldous Huxley's work, his Brave New World, he's not, he wasn't warning people. His work is actually sort of like the plan, and at Princeton's Mud Library, there's a book there that he wrote, and it's unpublished. It's technically a manuscript. It's called Enemies of Freedom, and it's a tongue-in-cheek 110, 120-page manuscript that lays everything out, and it tells you exactly, if you read it, between the lines, you can see that he's laying out exactly how to do everything. And then, of course, Julian Huxley ran UNESCO and the British Eugenics Society and was a signer of the Eugenics Manifesto. And basically, Julian did like the scientific background, and Huxley sold it to the public. He was like the campaign manager of it all. And so Huxley was behind, he was a key architect of MK Ultra. Like I said, if people want to read some of Huxley's letters, in the book, The Letters of Aldous Huxley, you can just read his suggesting many of these studies, like to Dr. George Esterbrook's or Dr. Andrija Puharic, or he's, talking with Wasson and other places. He's hanging out with, who's the guy that killed the elephant? Dr.
Jolly West?
Louis Jolyon West. So he's talking with him, and they're all hanging out at each other's houses and all of this stuff. But we're supposed to believe that, while he's like directing studies and recommending studies, the CIA just happened to hear this little piece from him. No, he was actively, throughout his work, recommending studies. He was on top of it. And, that is part of the cover story that, that he wasn't really, a part of MK Ultra, but, I think the first MK Ultra publication was his Doors of Perception, which came out about 14 months after MK Ultra was funded. And then, of course, his experience with mescaline when he wrote, Humphrey Osmond, was the day that MK Ultra was funded by the CIA. So, there's just all this tongue-in-cheek slapstick that they want you to believe. It's just coincidence. Serendipitously. So I took their serendipitous stuff and I flipped it upside down and turned it into a kind of a joke. And I got that from Dave McGowan. He started pointing that out in his work, so I just kind of took it and ran with it.
You show the dry approach. Yeah, it's very effective, by the way, as we're writing. It's a pleasant read. That type of tone.
Well, it's a little sarcastic, I guess, but it's like when you're staring at this information and all their lies for so long, you're just like, come on, guys. I mean, it's just the dumbest slapstick when you get in there and you start looking at their citations and what they actually say is just, oh, come on, you're kidding me, right? So this latest article, it's really almost a book. It's about 80 pages, but it's got 195 citations, and I lay out exactly where everybody can go and find all of the data and everything. So please double check me. Don't believe me for my own word. Go in there and verify my work so that you know what I'm saying is true. These people said this stuff. Jan Irvin isn't making it up. It's not something that I'm saying. I'm laying out all of the evidence and showing the public how the CIA and intelligence community have controlled the whole conversation on MKUltra since the 70s, and that the people who were your psychedelic heroes, your music heroes, those guys, they were the key CIA operatives behind MKUltra. Not these just mysterious doctors working on the Manchurian Candidate, sort of Frankenstein thing. I mean, we know Tim Leary was CIA. We know Gordon Wasson was CIA. We know Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, Ralph Metzner, all of those guys were CIA. We know that they were all running these tests everywhere for the CIA and other military intelligence, Army intelligence, Navy intelligence as well. But these were the guys that got famous, the guys that they put in your faces and paraded all over the TV and the radio and the books. Those are the guys that were running MKUltra. So they've manufactured the whole story surrounding MKUltra that they've sold to the public.
So we're running a little short on time, so we've established a fact. You showed me the evidence to show that there was an ambitious effort to experiment with the general population by, I guess you could say, seeding it with LSD and promoting these rock bands like the Grateful Dead,
Sure.
maybe even promoting the festivals themselves.
Oh, I think absolutely. I think there's a lot of evidence that the Woodstock Festival was an op.
It was like a mind-based trauma program, outdoor. That's
and when you look at the irony of the whole thing, they have this thing for people on the bad trips called the pig pen. Everybody is in the mud, out in the rain, and they're basically fornicating in the mud in front of their quote unquote rock idols. Get it? Dionysian mysteries. Ha ha ha.
That's right. And of course, the whole time is the you could say the silent majority, the solid middle class, is watching these things in horror. And there's your Hegelian dialectic.
Well,
right?
Sure. And, and they're trying to create a shock out of the public, and so this is the whole purpose of this. It's the shock effect. Just like, 9/11, you create this huge shock on the culture, and Ken Kesey, and all of these idiots going around, all loud and with their loudspeakers and handing out LSD everywhere, doing their quote unquote acid tests, right? This was just all for shock value, so. They basically wanted to destroy the Protestant work ethic and destroy the backbone of the family so that they could, and I don't know if you had a chance to check it out, but in my latest 2 episodes on nonviolent communication and the Trivium, we show how this was done intentionally and how they were, marketing essentially, communism and a total loss of any, personal freedom, property freedom whatsoever through these methods. So this was all connected together, and we see Terence McKenna and Rhiannon Eisler and all of them working to sell that, that same information. And all of that also goes back to changing images of man. And in the nonviolent communication episodes, we also show how Rhiannon Eisler, and it's right on her wiki page, she works for the Club of Rome. She went to school, was at UC Santa Cruz at the same time Bateson was there, who helped found the CIA. She's there when Richard Bandler was there, who helped create, Carl Rogers and Gregory Bateson, and Carl Rogers and Gregory Bateson were both MKUltra. Carl Rogers was MKUltra Subproject 97, but they created near-linguistic programming, which then later became nonviolent communication. So we show a direct line down from, all of that into their techniques today to basically make truth and logical conversation violent. Oh, you're being violent, you're being negative, you're being this or that. Anything that deals with truth or whatever needs to be pushed out, pushed away. You're being bad. I'm not going to talk to you because you're quote unquote negative. That sort of behavior. And those are all ad hominem attacks. It's just, it's a way of killing the messenger and dismissing the information without hearing it. And that's what they want. Who does it benefit for you to not get information? Does it benefit you or the other person that wants you not to get that information? If something saves you or your family's life or protects you and your family, doesn't it behoove you to listen to what that information is before you strike it out? It's really interesting because in that regard, almost every email I've ever gotten, more than 99% easily, have been from people who have never read or studied my work. I'm not kidding you. And they will, they will hear about it from someone else, go on a rampage, and send me these wild name-calling emails about I'm an idiot, I'm an ass, blah, 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 I'm this, I'm that, and I'm not spiritual. And I'm just going, really? Wow. So you just launched into a name-calling rampage on me to tell me that I'm the one that's not spiritual. Gotcha.
What's interesting is when I read your work, and I actually do read your work, and listen to your shows. I compare it, like I mentioned, compared to the works of others, and I see that I see a pattern or some similarities there. I like it when I come across a diverse group of people doing some research who come from different backgrounds, and the evidence takes them towards the same direction. You know what I'm saying? Well,
use the trivium so that you're verifying and coming to that conclusion on your own. Don't just believe it because I say it. The trivium is essentially asking who, what, where, and when, and then you decide why something took place, and then you can explain how you reached your conclusion to others, and you can walk them exactly through the path that you took to reach that conclusion. So if they have questions, they should be able to point to this specific piece of evidence. Or if they have new information and they bring it in, you can just look at it and review everything. You've got it systematically, reviewed so that, it's like you lay all the car parts from your car engine or whatever out on the driveway, and you want to figure out what they all are, and you label them and you put them all alphabetically or whatever, and you know what's all there. And then the logic aspect, the why part, is you understand what all these parts are. You can remove all the contradictions, and you can put the whole engine back together, get in and start the thing, right? And then the how would be like a Chilton's car manual explaining how you did it. And so if somebody comes in with new information, it's a really simple process to go back through and review it and figure out where it goes, because you have a systematic method for going through anything that you study. General grammar first, who, what, where, and when, then logic, which is why, and then rhetoric, which is how. And then, another way to put it would be the general grammar part is knowing or knowledge, getting to know all the little parts. And then the why part is understanding them. And then the rhetoric part or how is, the explaining it is the wisdom part. You have workable knowledge and understanding that you can then explain to other people.
And that is the primary function of your website, correct?
Yeah, that especially my Trivium Education website, and we leave all of the Trivium work for free up there. But it's this simple process, the Trivium method. It can and under the why aspect, when you put things in order, see. Part of mind control is getting people to come to conclusions before they've looked at facts. So essentially what that means is that you put why something happened before you asked who, what, where, when. And so except for the occasional chance, you can only come to false conclusions. So this is how things like quantum physics and stuff derive, and how we get so many people caught up in nonsense because they don't ask questions. They're basically left to, channel the information from Uranus or wherever they get it from, right? So what happens is when you have a systematic method and you realize that, you were taught this in 3rd or 4th grade, that it's who, what, where, when, why, how. Well, that's how we gather anything we can know in the universe. And it's not a filter. Our senses, our five senses, are not filters, ladies and gentlemen. This is how we acquire data. Without our senses, we have no data. So what they've done is they've tricked people into thinking that your senses are actually filters rather than how we gather all knowledge in the universe. So if we have a systematic method to go through it, who, what, where, when, why, and how, then we can look at anything, we can check ourselves, and under the logic aspect, if we see any contradictions, we can remove those contradictions. And under quantum physics, they'll say, well, a contradiction just means that, you can't know anything, that truth doesn't exist. There's 11 or 50,000 parallel universes and anything can happen. But what a contradiction really is a lie or an error. So anytime you see one, if you just go down further until there are no more contradictions, you'll come to the truth. And, a lot of people say, well, you can't know the truth. But yes, there are specific things that you can know the truth from. We don't want to use a lesser to the greater fallacy, which a lesser fallacy is, I know it's true that I'm sitting here talking to you on your show, Tim, and I have a glass of water in my hand, and I just took a drink. Now, do I have the truth of the whole universe? That's what they'll take it to, and they'll say, ha, 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 you can't know anything. Yeah. So they'll take it from the lesser to the greater and then back to the lesser again, right? And it's just poor critical thinking. So when you realize
everything is believable, nothing is knowable.
Right. And if you realize that a contradiction is a lie or an error, you can dig deeper. And then also I recommend people learn and study the logical fallacies until you have them memorized, and then eventually you become fluid, and as information comes in, your mind catches it automatically. At first, as you're reading things, you're like, what was that? Let me go look that up again. Then after, a few months, couple of months, your mind remembers them, and it just starts becoming fluid. And, and about 2 years into the Trivium study, you really start to catch the stuff. But, what happens is when you know the logical fallacies, instead of getting that funny feeling, that somebody's lying to me, what happens, you go from implicit knowledge, that funny feeling, to explicit knowledge. I know the exact type of lie that this person just tried to use against me, the exact logical fallacy. And then you can counter it. And then what happens is after about 2 months of studying the logical fallacies, you start to catch them in your own thoughts. And then when you catch them in your own thoughts, then you can, begin to remove them and verify the information in your own mind. Okay, I believe this since I was 10 years old. Is it true? And you look it up, geez, this is completely ridiculous. And a lot of people will say, well, I just don't have time to look all that stuff up. Well, let me put it another way to you. You can spend your whole lifetime believing in lies, or you can spend a few minutes or hours or days looking something up. And let's say if it took you a year to look something up, well, and you're writing all the notes about it and everything, you're writing all out. Well, guess what? You've written a book. So now publish it and allow other people to know that information. And then we have people putting out valid information instead of information put out by these intelligence cells and groups that we talked about earlier. So people can go through this process, and then rather than saying, oh, well, it's a negative, if I have to go spend time and learn something, well, look at it as a benefit to you in your future. You're saving yourself from a lifetime and believing in a lie, and then you can empower others with that information as well.
Yes, that's a good note to end this interview on. I just want to ask you one thing. So basically, the reason why the CIA, the foundations, were out there supporting the sexual revolution, drug use, feminism, pornography, environmentalism, abortion, gay rights, atonal music, modern art, that was just to destroy the aesthetics, confuse people.
Well, yeah, it's basically an all-around degradation of society, and they're trying to bring about a neo-feudalism. And if you get in and study Rian Eisler's work and Terence McKenna's work, which I do lay out in part 2 of the new episode on nonviolent communication for those who want to check that out, they explain it all right there. But in Manufacturing the Deadhead article, we do explain the neo-feudalistic agenda, and we can see that with Agenda 21 and all of this stuff from the UN and all of these environmental programs, et cetera, that are going on. They tell you that carbon is bad while all life is based on carbon, and the more carbon there is, the faster the plants grow. They give us oxygen. So, and then there's this whole cycle that goes on. So, they're selling us a lot of different stuff. And, Aldous Huxley's grandfather was the propaganda manager for Charles Darwin. So, Julian and Aldous' work are based on all of that. And then what they want you to do is believe that, it's all about human evolution and all of this stuff. But what they're really doing is they're trying to kill off the masses to selectively elevate themselves as, from killing off all of us. So it's not a real evolution. It's basically, just a dumbing down and cleansing. It's a soft kill, and they want all of the masses to, believe in all of the magic and all of the tricks, and to not think critically, not to, trust your own five senses. If they can get you to not trust your own five senses to verify things, then they destroy your self-esteem, and then you're left to appeal to authority or any information or magic show that they give you. If you can't trust yourself to look up information, you're going to buy into hoopla like Amit Goswami and, quantum physics and all of that nonsense, right? So,
or Fox News or MSNBC.
Or Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or any of the rest of them, right? So you have to gain your own trust back, your own self-esteem back. This is about empowering you to learn to trust yourself. Go out and just try it out. See what happens when you ask who, what, where, when, why, and how. Anytime you approach a new subject, and in fact, if you approach a new subject every time as though you're completely incompetent and then start off by asking those questions, then you realize you actually have to process the data in that specific way, and then you create a pattern, a systematic pattern that you can go through and verify. And then you realize, wow, using this method, and you can apply it to anything and under just about any situation, then you realize that your self-esteem goes up, but you know that information. And people can come and try to attack you on it or whatever, but you've studied every aspect of it. And, there's nothing that you haven't looked at that they can throw at you to try and find, some hole, in your work or something, because, they haven't verified the citations or they have some religious new age bias or whatever against it, So it helps people to get back onto the facts. And as you do it, your self-esteem will build, your pace will, it will quicken the more you do it. And, if your other choice, I guess, if you don't want to study that, be a slave. It's up to you.
Just keep watching the shadows on the wall, right?
Keep watching the shadows on the wall, ladies and gentlemen. This goes all the way back to Plato, is what he's referring to, the allegory of the cave. So there you go.
But I know you've done a number of interviews regarding the chemical adulteration of humanity, regarding with BPA, and then you have the cultural agendas with feminism and the arts and all that. But ultimately, I guess you would say, doesn't it come down to just depopulation?
Yeah, they sell it as religion and everything. They want people to think that they're evolving themselves with all of the spiritual New Age stuff that they sell. But the real agenda is, they want to kill off about, Huxley and all these guys. They want about no more than probably about 1 billion people. And,
just like the Georgia Guidestones.
Right. Yeah. So that's basically the agenda. But you can read about it right there in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, or his Brave New World Revisited, or Island, or my goodness, he published the whole plan, ladies and gentlemen. It's right there. Just study it, wake up for yourself. Once you can see MK Ultra for what it is, these intelligence communities and their agendas and this whole government agenda, global agenda, is pretty naked and impotent.
And it wasn't Aldous Huxley who made the observation that as sexual freedom waxes, political freedom wanes?
Yeah, well, that goes back to Freud, right? Freud talked about the Oedipus complex and that being a core of society. So, of course, they would use sexuality. And the whole porn thing, what's interesting about that, and they try and spin it like, women are the victims of that. Actually, the men are, because men are visually stimulated. And then what happens is it makes males who or participate properly within relationships, be attracted with women, etc. So it really affects men much more than it does women, and that's a whole, part of that thing that nobody really talks about,
That's depopulation.
Right, and right. So, in fact, I did an episode with Greg Wilson on pornography. If any of your audience is addicted and they want to check that out, that'll definitely
Is that what your
help
brain
them.
on porn? Is that what the title?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And how the brain actually, because it messes up the chemical. I guess the
Sure. Well, yeah.
brain,
It's
yeah. And if you look at the hit, it goes back to the Rockefellers with Kinsey and the pill and Gloria Steinem.
Oh, sure.
Okay, that was Jan Irvin. His website is Gnostic Media. It's gnosticmedia.com. He also has a podcast, Gnostic Media Podcast. I urge people to go listen to those and read his articles. It's he's a source of very